Well, according to World Population Review, 2.38 billion people practice some form of Christianity globally. This means that about 1/3 of the world's population is Christian. Now, Islam is the second largest world religion with 1.91 billion, or almost 25% of the world's population. Jesus has tons of followers right now. So what kind of leadership genius started that movement? Even by ancient cultural standards, Jesus' popularity grew to have a lot of followers. At times, thousands of people would gather to hear him teach and see what he would do. But Jesus was very intentional. He was intentional about recruiting 12 men to be part of his team. These were unlikely recruits who were leaders in the making, and they came from all different professions and walks of life. None of them were leadership gurus or marketing professionals. Most of them, in fact, were more likely to hurt rather than help the branding of Jesus. But Jesus recruited teams, and he invested in leadership. And it looks a little different than leadership development today. In today's episode, we are looking at the unique aspects of team leadership with Jesus and the disciples.
Faith habits connect your everyday behaviors with your belief system. Rather than letting the pressures and popularity of this world define you, the Faith Habit Show for Success will keep you focused on God's priorities for your life. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Lisa Tony.
Well, in Matthew 10, 2-4, we have a list of the disciples. It says this: these are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So this list, it's a list of fishermen, a tax collector, business owners, a political zealot, an accountant with criminal tendencies. It was definitely a diverse motley crew. Some of the disciples, we don't have any information on their professions before becoming disciples of Jesus. But Jesus, he was this wandering, itinerant rabbi who began to assemble a team. Jesus was a great recruiter because he spoke into people's deepest needs. One of my favorite stories is about how Jesus recruited Peter and James and John. Can you envision the scene? Maybe covered in the damp residue of the sea as hands worked to repair nets that were their livelihood. In Peter, those firm muscles would have tensed in his arms as he hauled heavy nets into neat piles. Those tanned arms moved rhythmically as his calloused fingers moved on autopilot until they found rips and tears that needed to be repaired. And every once in a while, his eyes would rise up to read the skies. It was second nature to him to keep an eye on the weather. He'd been watching the sky since he was old enough to go on a boat with his dad. Red skies at night and sailors delight. Red skies in the morning, sailors take warning. The seas were respected. Those waters were deep and life-giving, but they could also turn within minutes and become dangerous and uncontrollable and threatened his boat. A bad day on the water meant no fish, and no fish for a fisherman was failure. No fish meant no paycheck, and no paycheck meant no food for his family. His life depended on those waters and his ability to fish out of them. He would carefully watch the prices of the fish market every day. A good day was a good catch, and a good catch meant money in his pocket. And money in his pocket meant that he and his family would live another day. He fished with his friends, James and John, the sons of thunder. They had lightning bolt tattoos because they were loud and passionate and quick-tempered and had an easy laugh. They were salty sailors. And one day when this itinerant rabbi came by, it completely disrupted their lives. It was one night after they had been out fishing all night and they had caught nothing. Zero. They were exhausted, discouraged. They were in bad moods. They sat washing their nets, ready to just go home and crawl into bed and erase the failure of the day. But Jesus, this wandering itinerant rabbi, came by, and he asked Peter to take him out in one of the fishing boats so that he could teach the crowds that had gathered on the shore. I mean, John, his friend, must have looked at Peter and given him one of those looks, a look of pity that you pass to your friend that said, glad it's you, bro, and not me. I'm out of here as soon as I'm done with these nets. But Peter, he obliged, not wanting to be disrespectful of a rabbi, a holy man who was in their midst. So Peter rowed him out, and Jesus sat in that boat, and he used the water to amplify his voice so that the crowds could hear his words. It wasn't every day that a group of fishermen got to host an up-and-coming popular rabbi in their home turf. Well, when Jesus got done speaking, he turned to Peter and asked him to take him out further into deeper water and put his fishing nets back out in that deep water. Peter must have just looked at Jesus. No disrespect, Rabbi, but you stick to teaching and I'll stick to fishing. We've been out there all night and there is no fish. Not a one fish, nothing, zero, big nada. It's time to head home, shower, get some hot coffee, and get some sleep. Peace out, dude. But something about the way Jesus asked made Peter agree. And so he did it. He rowed out deeper. He got out all of his nets that he had just brought in and cleaned, and he threw them out over the boat, just like Jesus asked him to do. And to his great surprise, all of a sudden he felt a familiar tug of the fish weighing his nets. But then it got heavier and heavier and heavier. He had never felt his nets weighed like this before. And as he began to pull them up, they were overflowing with fish. There were so many fish that the nets started to break. Peter's nets were actually ripping out due to so many fish. And Peter called to shore and called for his partners, John and James, to join him in their boat. Well, they could not haul the fish in fast enough. Their nets were not big enough or strong enough for all these fish. There were so many fish. Where did they come from? And why did Jesus attract all these fish? And suddenly the weariness of the night left John and James and Peter, and they just worked on hauling in fish. More and more and more. They filled the bottoms of their boats. They began to have piles in their boats. They were ankle deep, and then knee deep, and then thigh deep, and then chest deep in fish. Now, Luke chapter 5 tells us that their boats were so heavy from fish that their boats began to sink. All three of them must have stared at this rabbi fisherman freak. What the heck was going on? Who was this guy, and why was he helping them fish? Why did the fish respond to him in this way? Well, that was it. They were hooked. They were in. They would follow him anywhere, and they did. They dragged their boats up on shore and left the biggest catch of their lives that would have made them rich. They left it sitting there, free fish for the taking, fish rotting in the hot Galilean sun, and they followed Jesus wherever he wanted to go. And it wasn't a sermon that changed them. It wasn't even seeing the sick healed or the dead come back to life. Peter gave his life to Jesus because he was the best darn fisherman he'd ever seen. Jesus nearly sank Peter's boat, and you don't mess with a fisherman's boat. Disrupted. Oh man, Peter was disrupted. And somewhere in the midst of the frenzy of fish, he realized he didn't need to be afraid of coming up empty anymore. He was tired of never being enough, coming up empty in maybe so many different places in his life, in his marriage, in his business, in his attempts to do the right thing. He just seemed to make so many mistakes. He had so many imperfections. He didn't always say or do the right thing. Honestly, he usually felt like he wasn't enough. But Jesus had done something he had never seen before. Jesus brought abundance out of emptiness. And if Jesus could provide that kind of abundance out of the unpredictable and unforgiving sea that was dark and empty for them? When all of their skill and expertise came up short, Jesus could do anything. Jesus had spoken right to the core of Peter's being. He spoke his love language, fish. And so it went. Jesus recruited 12 men and put a team together. Within that team of 12, there was even another small group team, Peter, James, and John. Now, each of them would later go on to hold significant leadership positions in the early church. And together, they witnessed miracles and moments with Jesus that the other apostles were not a part of. There was the time that Jesus raised a girl from the dead in Mark 5:35 through 43. There was the transfiguration when Jesus began to glow on a mountain in Matthew 17:1 through 13. And there was those moments of Jesus' weakness in the Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew 26:36 through 46. Sometimes Jesus would even send out smaller teams in groups of 2. Luke 10 gives us an example of this when Jesus appointed 72 people and sent them out 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. And he gave them authority to heal and speak words of peace on behalf of Jesus. We see that Jesus divided up groups with different numbers for different responsibilities. He utilized them to grow the movement with specific opportunities and tasks. Now, I want to look back at one of the specific verses that talks in detail about how Jesus interacted with his team. We find this in Mark 3:13 through 15. And it says this: Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to them those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. Well, as a team leader, Jesus went up to a mountain to get perspective. He prayed, he evaluated before choosing who should join his team. Now, putting together a team as a Christ follower should always involve prayer, time, and an intentional thought process. Jesus modeled that for us. And then Jesus called those that he wanted. He invited them in. He got incredible buy-in based on what he did with them. With Peter, with James, and John, it was about the fish. He also would later do this with Matthew after he called him as a tax collector who was extremely unpopular and unliked because of tax collectors' reputations as cheats and scoundrels. But Jesus would befriend Matthew and even go to his house and have dinner and hang out with his friends. Well, this verse continues to talk about how the disciples came to Jesus. He didn't force anyone to leave their old life. He wasn't a dictator. It was an invitation to an adventure that 12 men were willing to disrupt everything they knew to follow this rabbi. He appointed them or commissioned them for a unique leadership job. Now, I'm not sure what kind of mission statement process Jesus took these 12 through, but they were all in and ready to spend 3 years wandering around the countryside, homeless, to invest in this movement, in this man, this leader. Jesus showed patience amidst their mistakes and their questions to develop them. The end goal was that they would be ready to lead this movement when Jesus was no longer there. So Jesus modeled for them teaching and healing and praying, casting out demons, all that they would be able to do through the power of Jesus and through the authority of Jesus. Jesus was a trainer, he was a model, and he was a coach. Through this model, we see Jesus developing a multiplication model to reproduce the vision of the movement and allow others to send, preach, drive out demons, heal together at a rate that was far greater than just Jesus by himself. We see that Jesus was willing to share his authority and his power with his team. Now, Jesus spent 3 years training these men to be leaders. Jesus' plan was to eventually have the disciples take over and carry on the work that he had started. What we know to be true about Jesus is that he chose ordinary and unrefined men to be his apostles. They were the commonest of the common. They were from rural areas. Likely some of them were farmers, and they were fishermen. Jesus passed over the elite, the aristocratic, the influential men of society, and chose mostly the men from the perimeter of society. And that's how it's always been in God's economy. He exalts the humble. Jesus is able to call and equip anyone who is willing to follow him. So let's just take a few minutes to look at some of the specific skills Jesus employed with his team. Jesus delegated. Jesus didn't do everything himself, even though some of the jobs he delegated weren't very exciting. The disciples had to learn that life wasn't always a surfing from one wave to the next. Jesus would send Peter fishing so that they could pay the temple tax in Matthew 17:27. He sent 2 of his disciples on a mundane job to fetch a colt in Matthew 21:1-2. But Jesus also gave his disciples exciting jobs to do, like healing the sick and casting out demons. Delegated tasks were sometimes overwhelming for the disciples, like being told to feed 5,000 men. They didn't know how to do that, and Jesus had to intervene. Jesus could always have done things better himself, but he delegated anyway, and that is how you build a team. Jesus leveled up his team. He called the disciples to do things that seemed impossible, to grow their courage, grow their faith, and grow their confidence. Jesus told Peter to get out of a boat and walk on water. Jesus cast the vision of the big, audacious, great commission. And Jesus preached the high expectations of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus also shared authority. Now, this is really hard for most leaders. They don't want to undermine their own authority. But Jesus shows us that when the senior leader shares authority, it can in fact ignite a powerful movement that is bigger than one person. Are mistakes made? Yes, of course. But that is how a leader grows. That is how we learn. Jesus gave feedback. And Jesus gave feedback to his team on a regular basis. When Peter would boldly declare that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God, the Son of the living God, Jesus quickly commended him. But only a few short verses later, he would rebuke Peter for not having the right priorities. When those 70 returned from going out 2 by 2, they're astounded. They were so psyched that even the demons were under their authority in Jesus' name. But Jesus was quick to remind them not to rejoice about the demons being subjected to them, but to keep their focus on the right thing, that their names were written in heaven. You see, feedback keeps a team on track with the vision and a good heart check. Jesus gave his team also a shared mission. This mission was around a common goal and purpose. Their shared mission was the Great Commission. Their common goal was to be witnesses empowered by the Holy Spirit, as in Acts 1:8. Giving the team focus and unity was crucial in keeping them together, keeping them encouraged, and moving the ball forward. And the result is synergy. After all, that is the beauty and the blessing of a team. The whole is greater than its parts. Even an unlikely team can do amazing things with great leadership. 2.38 billion people today are so thankful.
Easy, intentional, and powerful. Faith habits. Get your free Power Up Prayer Guide today at lisatoni.com/powerup. Thanks so much for joining me today on Faith Habits for Success. Here's to good faith habits, my friend. Be strong and courageous and stand firm in your faith. See you next time. Bye for now.